Hello everyone, Angel with Outsider Perspective, and here to cover some very important recent developments regarding Eastern Asia. So 2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister of Japan, Sanae Takaichi, said, "If there are battleships and use of force, no matter how you think about it, it could constitute a survival-threatening situation." And what she meant is a survival-threatening situation for Japan. And that was said in relation to Taiwan. In other words, if mainland China launched a military attack against Taiwan, then Japan could respond with military action. Now, I'm being very deliberate with my words here. She said that it could respond with military action, not that Japan would respond with military action. Japan does not have any standing security agreements with Taiwan. I'll get into that more a bit later. And when I'm doing videos, by the way, I will generally try to include links and sources for the things that I say in my videos. The first thing to understand is that Japan, according to the Japanese Constitution, which was written by Americans, the nation of Japan is forbidden from waging war as a way to resolve international conflicts. Basically, Japan invaded many countries in around the 30s and starting around the 30s and 40s, basically during World War II period, they invaded many countries. And as a way to control Japan, America wrote Article 9 of their Constitution and said you can no longer wage war as a way to resolve issues. So basically, this led to the creation of the Japanese Self-Defense Force, the JSDF, and they're only supposed to be used defensively. Now, that's recently changed. I recently learned that as of 2015, the law was expanded so that Japanese troops can participate in war, overseas war, if an ally is attacked. So, who is an ally of Japan? I'll get to that in a moment. Now, the island of Taiwan has not always been under Chinese control. Actually, Taiwan was under Japanese control for some time. Actually was a colony of Japan. But basically, after the Japanese lost World War II, Taiwan was returned to China. At the time, mainland China was not completely under communist control. Now it is. Anyway, basically after World War II, Japanese lost Taiwan. That's the point. And after World War II, the civil war between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party resumed. The Kuomintang lost, they retreated to Taiwan, and that's where they remain today. Now, going back to the 2015 law change in Japan, officially speaking, Japan does not recognize Taiwan as a country. But even if Japan did want to legally recognize Taiwan as a country, it would be pointless because Taiwan itself has never declared independence from mainland China. So Japan recognizing Taiwan as a country would essentially be the same thing as telling Taiwan that it is a country, even though they've never declared independence from mainland China. Why they haven't declared independence from mainland China is a different story. But essentially, the main reason why is because as soon as Taiwan declares independence, mainland China would immediately attack them. They don't want to be attacked, so that they want to basically maintain the status quo, which is why they have not declared independence. Regardless, Japan does not recognize them as a country. And for the first time in many decades, Japan is experiencing rapid militarization. So why? Why would they be militarizing themselves rapidly? Well, the main reason why you would want to develop yourself militarily in a fast amount of time is obviously because you're preparing for war. And in the decades leading up to the Japanese invasion of China, which ended in the loss of tens of millions of lives, that was also a period of rapid military development in Japan. Now, the funny thing about this article that I read from the Japan Times is that it says that Japan is looking to develop its self-defense capabilities by developing and acquiring long-range missiles. Well, China is not that close to Japan. Why does Japan need long-range missiles to defend itself from a nation that isn't even that close to it? Well, it seems quite obvious that the reason why they're doing that is long-range missiles can hit China. That would be the point. Because obviously if they wanted to just defend Japan, they would get missiles that have a shorter range so that if any incoming missiles were to come in from mainland China into Japan, they could shoot down the missiles. But obviously that's not what they're doing. They're preparing to attack China. But in order to understand what's really going on, we kind of have to look to the past, because history is a great teacher. In fact, it's one of the best teachers. We strongly believe that here on this channel. So let's just review some of the historical facts that have led up until this moment. The only time in history that Japan was invaded by China was during the Yuan dynasty, and that was in the 12th century. Now, the Yuan dynasty was actually a Chinese dynasty that was Mongolian-led. So actually, if you look into these invasions, they're not referred to as Chinese invasions. They're referred to Mongolian invasions because that's quite literally what they were. It was Mongolians, Chinese people, and Koreans. It was basically Chinese and Koreans under Mongolian coercion invading Japan. That's basically what happened. Anyway, the invasions failed, but that's kind of a different story. And the first time that Japan ever attempted to invade China was during the 15th century. And this is a conflict that's referred to as the Imjin War. And basically what happened was that Japan wanted to invade China and destroy China. So what they did was they went to Korea and they said, hey, Korea, because Korea was basically a client state. Well, actually, how would you say? Korea was a tributary state to China at that time. So they went to Korea and they said, allow us, the Japanese, to march through Korea. And when we march through Korea, we will invade China. So allow us to pass through your country peacefully, or we will kill you. The Japanese said, no, we're loyal to China. We will not allow you to pass through and attack China. That's what happened. I'm not going to offer my opinion about it. That's just simply what happened. But basically what ended up happening is because the Koreans refused to let them through, they said, okay, we will just destroy Korea. And they killed many, many, many people in Korea. And that's the Imjin War. Since then, there have been multiple invasions of China again by Japan. So during World War I, the Japanese seized a place called Qingdao, which at the time there were German troops stationed in Qingdao. And they seized Qingdao from the Germans. At the time, China was actually neutral in the war, didn't want to participate in the war. And basically Japan violated China's sovereignty by seizing Qingdao from the Germans. And also during the Boxer Rebellion, China was also again invaded by Japan under the Eight-Nation Alliance. And then China was also invaded 2 more times by Japan during the First and Second Sino-Japanese Wars. So in total, Japan has invaded China at least 4 times. There may be more invasions that I'm not thinking about. I'm not including like Japanese pirate raids on coastal Chinese villages because that happened many, 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 many times. So I don't want to like inflate the number. And then also on top of that, piracy was, I don't want to blame the state of Japan for piracy. It's lawlessness. And also Chinese people also raided Japanese islands in pirate raids. So I'm not going to include those as actual invasions. But anyway, during the last invasion of China by Japan, the Second Sino-Japanese War, over 20 million Chinese people died, mostly due to starvation, but also hundreds of thousands of people were deliberately and intentionally killed by the Japanese in warfare, including soldiers, but also many, many civilians. If you want to learn more about it, I encourage you to read literature about the Second Sino-Japanese War. But the point is that there's a very clear and consistent pattern of Japanese aggression against China, because for many hundreds of years, the explicit goal of the Japanese government has been to completely destroy the Chinese government, take over China, and then when they're finished taking over China, they would probably invade other countries. As a matter of fact, they explicitly said that they would invade other countries after they were finished with China. But again, that's kind of a different situation. I want to focus in this video on China. So Japan has had an obsession with the destruction of China, but China has not really had an obsession with the destruction of Japan. I'm not really going to get too much into why. I think that the ocean simply provided a natural barrier, and that it was kind of not really too much more trouble than it was worth, so they kind of just left them alone. I'm not going to say that China has no history of military aggression, but China does not really have a recent history of military aggression. And as a matter of fact, the last time that China was involved in a real military conflict was during the Sino-Japanese War, the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979. Basically, Chinese troops invaded Vietnam around 1980. I'm not really going to discuss why, but that's what happened. And so anyway, basically the point is that since 1979, it's like 50 years ago, they haven't been involved in any military conflict. They don't really have a history, and they don't have a recent history of aggression. And for literally hundreds of years, the nation of Japan, as I said, their explicit goal is to invade and destroy China. So this latest business with Taiwan is just in a reemergence of this goal. Basically, Taiwan used to belong to Japan. Japan is talking as if it still belongs to Japan. Remember that the Prime Minister of Japan said that the invasion of Taiwan would constitute a survival-threatening situation for Japan. But that doesn't make sense, because Taiwan has not belonged to Japan since the 1940s. So how could that possibly even be true? And Taiwan is not recognized as a country by Japan, so even if Taiwan was attacked, it would not constitute an attack on an ally, which would necessitate the involvement of the Japanese military. So how does this work? How does this actually function? Well, basically, my assessment is that the Japanese government will fabricate a reason to attack China regardless, basically, of what happens, because that's what they did before. During the lead up to the Second Sino-Japanese War, they accused the Japanese of blowing up railways, and that was the justification for their invasion of Manchuria in 1931. But basically, a recent poll determined that 48% of the polled Japanese said that they would support attacking mainland China if they invaded Taiwan. Now, whether this poll is representative of the population of Japan, I cannot really say, but 48% is a really high number, so I will, again, include that in the description below. Actually, that was quite shocking information for me. But anyway, there's over 20 U.S. military bases in Japan, so it's quite safe to say that Japan is firmly under American control, and they have been since the end of World War II. So basically, the Prime Minister of Japan would not threaten to attack China unless she was under the impression that America would support such a decision. But, like I said, how does this work legally? But you may not be aware of this, actually. There are American military troops permanently stationed in Taiwan, or the Republic of China. So, if mainland China attacked Taiwan, and a single missile touched an American military base.
I actually misspoke here. There are no U.S. military bases in Taiwan. There are U.S. military troops permanently stationed in Taiwan, but there are no actual U.S. military bases in Taiwan right now.
That would mean that an ally of Japan was attacked. And that would be a good enough excuse for the American government to drag Japan into a war with the People's Liberation Army. Because America is an ally of Japan, and if one of the American military personnel is attacked, that would constitute an attack on an ally, and that would definitely be impetus for the Japanese to go to war. Again, against China. Now, what I want to remind you of, again, during the 1930s and 40s when Japan and China were at war, or when I would say when China was actively being invaded by Japan, Japan ended up getting about 20 million Chinese people killed, and they still lost. That's incredible. That's, wow, amazing. And Japan had a serious military advantage over the Chinese at that time. Like, literally, China basically didn't have an air force. And if the Japanese could not defeat the Chinese when they had an overwhelming technological advantage, strong air support, strong naval and air support, how would they defeat the Chinese today? When they're a country of 150 million people and China reportedly has a population of roughly 1.4 billion and has been rapidly modernizing their military, has some of the highest, if not the highest, steel production in the world, churning out battleships left and right. How would they possibly win when they couldn't even do it 60 years ago when Japan was basically a giant agrarian backwater? It's not going to happen. But that's not America's problem. I'll get to that in a moment. So basically, unless you really hate Japanese people and seriously want a lot of them to die, I don't understand why you would support Japanese military aggression against China right now, because this is not the 1930s. This is not a situation where a military that is vastly equipped, vastly over-equipped compared to its adversary, they don't have a great technological advantage over China anymore. They just don't. They don't have... It would just be a complete disaster for Japan. It really would be, because the mainland Chinese, it would just be so bad for them. And basically, the situation that happened in Japan during World War II with the Americans was that the Americans would launch air raids into Japan and use napalm to burn down their houses, like the Tokyo air raids, the napalm raids. They killed so many people because Japanese houses are made of wood, and they would just burn them down all day. So basically, China would have the ability to do the same thing. All they really need to do is fly air raids and have an embargo against Japan, and that would really, really mess them up a lot. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. America still has a strong military, and they wouldn't just sit and let Japan be completely destroyed. But at the end of the day, if every single person in Japan died from a war with Japan, they're not American. So the Americans are just going to keep going to McDonald's, and it's business as usual. Look at what's going on in Ukraine. American politicians openly brag about depleting the Russian military without a single American being directly involved in the war, at least in an official state-sanctioned capacity. In any case, the Americans aren't sending American troops to go fight and die in Ukraine. And the politicians are happy about that, because the Ukrainians, yeah, a lot of them are dying, but they're not Americans. Similar situation. Japan may soon become the Ukraine of East Asia, to the great delight of the politicians in Washington. So basically, this video is not really to be pro or anti anything. I'm just simply giving you my assessment. And Japan is in a very dangerous position by threatening China. But Americans are not. Because at the end of the day, Chinese missiles, Chinese artillery, Chinese naval ships can easily reach Japan. They cannot easily reach America. They cannot even easily reach Hawaii. And the Japanese are really playing with fire. But what I will say is that the Chinese usually don't do anything, and they don't have the military backbone of Russia. So the Japanese are basically trying to treat them like cowards. And not a bullet has been fired yet, so maybe they're partially right. Remember that Americans did not drop one, but two military atomic bombs on Japan. Why did they do that? They dropped two nuclear bombs on Japan because they wanted to avoid a land invasion of Japan. Why did they want to avoid a land invasion of Japan? Because if the Americans had to do a land invasion of Japan, then a lot more American people would have died. A lot more American people would have died. But if we just kept running air raids against them and bombing them and having embargoes against them, then Japanese people would get burned alive. They would starve to death. But Americans wouldn't die. And that's what matters. American lives, not Japanese lives. That is how people in America think. That is how politicians in America think. And to be honest with you, at the end of the day, obviously you should care about the people that are in your country more than you should care about the people in other countries. That is the way of the world. It's important for Japanese people to remember that. And that is how I want to end this video. Remember that nobody cares about your country more than you do. And that if you're more useful as a meat shield to achieve another country's strategic objectives, then that's what you will be. Just remember that. And thank you for your attention today. God bless you.